What if the very way that you connect with God is totally different from your spouse? And that's actually a good thing. On today's episode, we're diving into sacred pathways, this idea that each of us has a unique spiritual wiring for how we experience God. We talk with Gary Thomas, author and pastor, about different ways that people connect with God and how that shows up in marriage. And spoiler, it doesn't mean you and your spouse aren't compatible for having different styles of worship. You'll hear plenty of practical advice and encouragement around honoring differences without feeling guilty or disconnected. If you've ever felt like you and your spouse are just not on the same page spiritually, or if you've carried guilt that your spiritual walk doesn't look the same as theirs, this conversation is for you. Let's get started. Gary Thomas, thank you so much for joining us today on the Wind-Shaped Marriage podcast. We're super excited to have you.
Well, I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
Now, Gary, could you tell our listeners that might not be familiar with who you are a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, well, I'm a pastor and writer. I've been publishing books for about 30 years. I've been married for 41, 3 adult kids, 2 grandkids. I'm teaching pastor at a church just outside of Denver, but I continue to write books and do a lot of conferences, and I've been at Windshape a bunch of times.
Yeah.
Love it there.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. We love to hear that. Now, Gary, I was really excited for this conversation today because this is one of those things that I didn't realize was a big part of my life until I discovered it, but the idea of spiritual pathways. And so I'm really excited to jump into that conversation today. You know, one of your well-regarded books, The Spiritual Pathways. Could you talk a little bit about what pathways are and what they mean?
Yeah. It's called the Sacred
Pathways. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was a very legalistic discipler in college, to be honest. I knew how you're supposed to have a quiet time, when, where, what you were supposed to do. And back then people talked about it. It's easy to hold people accountable to. I could hold myself accountable to. So I was the most unlikely person to write a book on the pathways. But what happened is I was asked to do a book on just rejuvenating your devotional times with God. And I don't want to get too mystical, Rob, but a lot of times when I'm writing a book, I feel like I'm an architect. You're making a drawing. Okay, we're going to have the rooms here, organize the house here. You put a roof here. It'll look like this. I felt more like an archaeologist, that the further I got into it, I just began to see these 9 different pathways that people connect with God. I saw them in scripture. I saw them in church history. A lot of Christian denominations mirror them. Just that people connect with God in different ways. And it created such a sense of freedom because they're all mentioned in scripture. We worship the same God. But for some people, we could just get into some, it's caregivers. They feel closest to God when they're caring for people in his name. They're the activists who feel closest to God when they're fighting God's battles. They're just any number of ones. Intellectuals, they need to understand something new about God for their heart to be opened up. Many different ways that we don't all have the same experience. And so that spend some time in a closed-in room with your eyes closed and your head bowed to pray. Maybe one of the worst ways to have a quiet time, for instance, if you're a naturalist whose heart is awakened to God when you get out of doors. And so I was probably the least likely person to write it, but it was a fascinating experience for me, reading about how others have connected with God, going through the work of spiritual directors throughout history, seeing different characters in scripture. It was a really fun book to write on, and it's been exciting just to see, I guess, just a sense of freedom and creativity it's given God's people as they learn to love God.
Yeah, I love that. And I think I might have shared this in the podcast before, but for listeners that might not know, my faith story is, I have a pretty typical faith story in that did the classic like youth camp thing, but it's also atypical in the sense that I really relate deeply to this idea of the sacred pathways, in the sense that we went away for like a fall camp or something with my church, and was really excited about, hey, like, what does it look like to connect with God on a deeper level? I think it was like my freshman year of high school. And so I was really excited to see, like, okay, what does mature faith look like? And all throughout the weekend, all my friends were really deep into worship and really deep into like this emotional outpouring of like what it means to connect with God. And I actually left that weekend feeling kind of empty because I
Hmm.
looked around and I saw all these people that were really pouring into worship and really connecting or really getting deep into like deep small group conversations or whatever it was. And I remember walking away thinking like, hey, my experience with God was not that. And so I had this whole long year of thinking like, okay, I did everything. Like I raised my hand during worship. I sang as loud as I could. I read all the devotionals. I did quiet time. And yet I still feel this distance. And so we went back the following year and we did the same camp, same place, all of that good stuff. And it was that same time of worship of like, I was really trying to, I was like, God, I'm going to really give everything I have this year. I'm going to really try and feel close to you and really like put my hands up and sing and all of that good stuff. And I came to the same spot of feeling kind of empty. Like, hey, I'm just kind of going through the motions. I feel like I'm just trying to perform here. And so I was really upset. And so I stepped out of the room and I just went for a walk and I walked through this field nearby. And I was just walking through nature and just took a moment to sit back and look up at the sky and look at the stars and think like, God, like, where are you? Why can't I hear you? And in that moment was the moment where I heard God, the clearest I've ever heard in my life, saying, I'm right here. And so for
Ah,
me, it was this reminder of like, yes, you can relate to God through worship. And yes, you can relate to God through Bible study and quiet time and all of those things. But also, it was so encouraging to me to know like I have my own unique way of relating to God. And I think there's probably a decent number of people in church that do have this deep connection to God, but they don't experience that on a day-to-day basis because church isn't typically like catered towards like some of the different pathways that you talked about. This idea of naturalists or emotion or anything like that. So,
well, you lived out Psalm 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of God. You had to get out of a building,
yeah.
away from artificial instruments, and you look up into the heavens and you hear the noises of nature, and all of a sudden, poof, God is meeting you right there. That's the classic naturalist.
Yeah, yeah. No, I love that. And so I think it's really important for people to hear it. And we'll get into the marriage side here in a minute because we're a marriage podcast and that's important. But really important for people to hear this idea that there are different ways of connecting and relating to God. I know we've mentioned a couple of them at this point. I'll run through the list. And if you don't mind, maybe just give like a one or two sentence description of what these are. I'll do my best to pronounce these the right way, and then you can correct me as needed. But so we talked about naturalist. Talk about naturalist real quick.
Yeah, their heart is awakened when they get out of doors. It could be in a forest, it could be by a river, it could be looking at the mountains. There's just something about being surrounded by what God has made. That's the best place for them to meet with God.
Yeah. All right. We have
Sensates.
sensate.
Um,
Okay.
yeah, if anybody's been to an Eastern Orthodox church, that's the classic sensate experience where God uses the five senses. Again, I grew up for praying. You close your eyes, you bow your head, you're cutting out all sensory information. The sensate is the opposite of that. It's what they touch, what they see, what they feel. They might like to be in an ornate um, cathedral, hear majestic music, even smell the incense, things like that, where their senses are brought into play. And that's what awakens their heart to God.
Yeah. It sounds like the whole environment just creates this kind of ambiance
Yes.
for them.
Yeah.
We have traditionalists, a pretty common one.
Yeah, loving God through ritual and symbol. They love to pray prayers that have been prayed for thousands of years. They often will be people of routine. They might have the same kind of quiet time in the same chair at the same time of day. It's not boring to them, it's life giving to them. They might follow the church calendar, use religious symbols. It's a very traditionalist view that some people call dead religion, but for a traditionalist, it very much makes their heart come alive.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. This one I'm going to need pronunciation help on for sure.
Ascetics.
Ascetics.
I got it.
Ascetics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It goes back to the practice of asceticism, but just think of the monk and the nun.
Okay.
It's somebody who likes to get away, who wants to be alone. They need time of solitude. They're like the opposite of a sensate in that they are distracted by outward noise and outward trappings and whatnot. They have an interior faith. So they're going to be quiet. They're going to get alone. They often are very strict, um, disciplines that will stretch their, you know, their comfort level and
Yeah.
what like that. But think of a monk or a nun, and that's kind of the ascetic's path.
Would you say something like fasting would fall under that
A
category?
100%.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the book goes through practices of the ascetic, and fasting is certainly one of them.
Gotcha. Okay, we have activists.
They're drawn to God in the midst of confrontation. For them, church is where you get your batteries recharged and where you sign people up for the petition or to be volunteers. It might be evangelistic, it might be a social justice cause or whatnot, but they just feel that God is closest to them when they're fighting God's battles.
Caregivers, you mentioned this one a little bit ago.
Yeah. Loving God by loving others. You think of Mother Teresa, where she said she felt Jesus was present when she's reaching out for lepers in Calcutta. But it could also be somebody that like EMT that works, in rescue squads or whatnot. It could be men that rather than sit and sing hymns in a church, they would rather go paint a widow's house or do
Yeah.
yard work for her. But as they're reaching out and caring for others, that's when God feels closest to them.
Yeah. Oh, that's really beautiful. All right, and then last few, enthusiasts.
They're sort of the charismatic people. They like to celebrate. They're the people that want to cancel the sermon and have the 2-hour worship
Yeah.
services. They tend to be extroverts, not necessarily, but celebration is just more fun when you're with a group. So they want excitement. They often need spiritual adventure. By charismatic, I don't just mean exuberance, but maybe while the traditionalist loves the fact that God is moving the same way he's moved through the centuries, enthusiasts are often, God, do something that you've never done before today.
Yeah.
Bring somebody my way that needs a word from you, that needs a gift of money or just an encouragement or something like that. So they emphasize the supernatural elements of our faith. They emphasize the celebratory aspects of our faith.
Yeah. And then this one, a common one too, intellectuals.
They love God through the mind. To open up their heart, you got to open up their mind. They need new data. When they understand new things about God, it helps them appreciate God. It makes them want to worship God more. What does it mean that he's omnipotent? What does it mean that he's omnipresent? What does it mean that he's eternal? Those kind of things that some people say, oh, it's just all in their head. But for a true intellectual, that's what awakens their heart as well, that the mind and the heart aren't against each other. The mind is actually the key that unlocks the heart's devotion.
Yeah. Those are the people that like love a deep podcast or engaging book or something like that. Like that's
Absolutely.
their love
Yeah.
language with God.
Yeah.
Well, I love the list of those 9 and the idea that we all have these unique ways of relating to God and that they might look differently. And it brings me to this idea of what that looks like in a marriage context. Because
Yeah.
the likelihood that, there's 9 different temperaments or pathways, the idea that you and your spouse are going to be on the same page is probably not that likely. And so talk about what pathways look like in a marriage context.
Well, it was actually through my marriage that God helped me get away from this legalistic view of discipleship I had and to appreciate that we meet God in different ways. Because I fell in love with my wife in college, long time ago, and we had entirely different kind of quiet times. I got up early because Jesus got up early. A lot of people throughout history got up early. I think God's a busy God. He might be off running China or Russia if you wait until 7 or 8. But Lisa is not a morning person. She would in college roll out of bed right before an 8 o'clock class, brush her teeth, brush her hair, go to classes, and then come back around noon. She loves to get into the sun. And you could go up onto the roof of our dorm and she would lay in the sun with her Bible, and she'd call that a quiet time. And in the flirty way college students do, I remember saying to her, oh, come on, Lisa, who goes up into the roof at noon, lays in the sun, and calls that a quiet time? Well, she couldn't say anything, but 2 weeks went by. I hear this knock on my dorm room door. I can still picture it. She's smiling. She goes to my desk. She opens up my Bible to Acts chapter 10, verse 9, and it says this: about noon the following day, Peter went up on the roof to pray. And I thought, what are the odds? And I look, I mean, it's my own Bible she's showing me. And I thought, oh, that's crazy. But here's the thing. I knew she had a vibrant relationship with God. I wouldn't have been interested in her if she didn't. But she had a different time and a different way of reaching out to him. And so I could appreciate that. I saw the fruit. I knew God was speaking to her. I knew God was shaping her, but she didn't have her quiet time first thing in the morning. And so Lisa's been good at this. She knows I need my time alone. I've got a little bit of the ascetic and a little bit of the intellectual in me. And so it might shock some people. We don't have the daily prayer times that some people talk about. We both have daily times of prayer, just not always daily time together. Lisa knows if I need to go out, I'm a bit of a naturalist like you too. Now, for a lot of times I can worship while I'm running, but sometimes I might take walks through the woods or something for that as well. She just respects that Gary's connecting with God is going to be a different thing. She has her thing. She likes to be in the sun. She does her group women Bible studies and whatnot. I think the important thing, Rob, is that as I'm drawn to the Lord and receive his love, I'm able to give more love. 1 John 4:19, we love because he first loved us. And the same thing for Lisa, as she connects with God, she's able to give love to me. And so I would say to married couples, it doesn't mean you're incompatible. If you have different styles of worship, I would support that and just recognize that you want to free them up so that if you're on vacation and your husband or wife is a bit of an ascetic and they need to get away and be alone, let them. They're going to be a better spouse to you. They're going to have more joy in the Lord if you let it happen. Don't feel like something's missing. On the other hand, if you're a contemplative, we didn't talk about that. That's the one that have kind of a quiet, meditative, emotional response to God. With an enthusiast, well, the contemplative is going to want to go maybe to the charismatic worship service of the enthusiast, but recognize that he or she may need to come home and just spend some time alone with God in quiet. And that's okay as well. So it's understanding that God meets us in different ways. And here's what I like, Rob, in marriage. I like that we could show our 3 children different ways of connecting with God. Mm. My oldest daughter had very much the naturalist in her, and she knew I was. We were taking a walk by these waterfalls one time, not too far from where we lived. We were in Bellingham, Washington at the time. And she sees this bench under a tree. She goes, "Oh, Dad, wouldn't that be a great place to have a quiet time?" Now, one of my kids, that would have been a terrible place to have a quiet time. They don't want to be quiet just in the woods. And so it's fun that kids can see, like you experience, you're at this worship service where they're just singing songs and you're saying, well, I don't really feel like I'm connecting with God that way. And it would be tragic if you thought, so I guess I'm just not into God, rather than there's a different way for me to meet with God. Yeah. And that's what I want kids to see, that their parents have a different relationship so they can have a different relationship.
No, I think that's beautiful. And this idea of there are other ways to connect with God other than ways that you experience in a traditional church service. And so if you're just going to church on Sunday and you're like, hey, I'm not feeling connected, like I'm just going through the motions, the likelihood is like there's probably a pathway or something that you're missing there. And so I think there's a lot of wisdom there. But one of the things I think that comes up in marriage is you have the one spouse that might have a pathway or a way of relating to God that is maybe more legalistic. The idea of I'm going to sit and have quiet time. I'm going to read my Bible. I'm going to have an hour a day. And then the other spouse doesn't relate to God that way. And so you almost see like this lording over the other spouse, this idea of like, you need to do this. What advice or encouragement would you give that couple?
Yeah, I've dealt with this as a pastor. A woman that looks at her husband askance because he's just not that into singing. And it's a church, the worship emphasizes singing. You say, well, he must have a cold heart toward God. But if there is, for instance, a widow's ministry or something needs to be done around the church, he's the first one to sign up and does it. And I'm just thinking, if you're God, would you rather have somebody singing songs to you or somebody that's helping out one of your kids that needs help? Now, it doesn't have to be either or. It can be both, but I'm just saying they're both equally valid forms of worship. And so I think just get over that judgmental spirit that if somebody isn't musical, that means they're not worshiping God. Rick Warren really enjoyed Sacred Pathways, and he heard me talk about it at a conference, and then asked me at that time to come on staff at Saddleback and to help lead worship, because he said he thinks one of the real things holding evangelicals back is that we equate worship with singing. Now, it just didn't work out in our life plan. I just moved. I told our kids they'd grow up where we were, that I wouldn't move them again. But no less a light than Rick Warren recognized we really need to broaden how we look at worship. It's not just singing.
Yeah.
And I think the church is richer for having different expressions. Here's a great way. People often see caregivers and the activists as different, as opposite forms of worship. So let's say you have a woman who's a caregiver, the husband who's the activist. And they might look askance at the other one, like you don't really care for individuals, you're always fighting these causes. But here's what I think is so brilliant about God creating us differently. The activist is trying to stop systemic evil. They want to stop it at the core. They're going to protest. Maybe they're working for laws. Maybe they're just trying to change structures. But that will never be perfectly done. And so you need somebody who feels closest to God when they're dealing with the victims of evil.
Yeah.
They're not stopping systemic evil, but they're working with the individual victims of evil to help them, to encourage them, to lift them up. It seems to me brilliant that God says, okay, I want people that are most excited stopping systemic evil. I want some people who are most excited helping the victims of evil. They're working for the same cause. They're worshiping the same God. But just like a football team, you have quarterbacks, you have linemen, you have running backs, you have wide receivers. If you've got a guy that's 160 pounds, you know he's not a defensive tackle. You know he's a punter or a kicker, right? And the team needs that. It might not work if you have a 300-pound punter.
Probably won't. Yeah.
Maybe they could. You never see them. So it'd be hard for them maybe to step around the rush. But the whole thing is, look at the church as, isn't God incredible that he's such a genius creator, that he creates people that love him with celebration, people that love, you need intellectuals that can provide a lot of teaching. You need the enthusiast that teaches God needs to be celebrated. All of these different things. It's just a beautiful expression that we will be richer when we start to respect the way other people worship God and learn from them instead of judge them. And marriage is a microcosm of that.
Yeah.
Learn how your spouse connects with God. Maybe try it out. I liken it to restaurants. Italian might be your favorite food, but maybe you don't want to eat Italian 6 days a week. Maybe you want to occasionally do Mexican or barbecue.
Yeah.
And you can look at the pathways that way. 5 days out of the week, I'm acting like an intellectual, but I like to stick my toe into the Contemplative or to the Enthusiast or the Sensate or something like that. And just see a new freedom in how God can energize your soul.
Yeah. Now, we talked about this idea of you and your spouse have different ways of relating to God. How does that work when it comes to spiritual connectedness in your marriage? This idea of like you are walking hand in hand in a relationship with Christ and what that looks like in a marriage context. You know, if you relate to God one way, your spouse relates to God in another way. How do you kind of intersect those or bring those into kind of a complete picture of marriage?
Well, I think it begins with respect. I respect that my way isn't the best way or the only way. 2, releasing my spouse to have time to worship God the way that best meets her needs. For instance, my wife loves to take hikes. When we live in Colorado, they're incredible hikes. But if I really want a time of connecting with God, my wife is also an extrovert who really likes to talk. And so that's not going to be a worship time for me. I can still enjoy the outdoors, but I can't say I'm really connecting. But then she's really good if she knows I'm going to go off for half an hour. It's not like I'm going to go off for a 5-hour hike on my own. But she understands there might be a time where I'll just sit by, or you open up your Bible. Boy, I'd love that. You probably, you read the Psalms by a creek or by a lake and things are quiet and it's just You feel the breeze. I mean, it's just wonderful for a naturalist.
Yeah.
Now, my wife and I, we like to be at church services together, and the worship, at our church is contemporary, and that's fun too. So we experience different things, but I think you just kind of respect each other and you release each other and you learn from each other, and not put too much pressure that you've got to do everything together.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, one of the things that I found a lot of fruit in for me is finding opportunities to invite my wife into what that looks like for me. I mentioned I lean pretty heavily into the naturalist category, this idea of, walking through the woods and getting to enjoy the beauty of God's creation. And one of the things that I've really enjoyed is finding opportunities to introduce my wife into my thought process, or kind of how I'm thinking in that moment, just to say like, hey, this is kind of what's going through my mind, even though she might not be in the same space in that moment of feeling the connectedness to God. But this idea of like, hey, I can kind of clue her in on where I'm at and kind of how I'm thinking about things too. So I found that was an interesting approach as well.
I try, but look, I've been married 41 years.
Yeah.
So my wife and I have been doing this, and I've realized just we are different people. We were in Florida earlier this year. I was speaking at a church, I think in the Tampa area. And so we spent 4 days at the beach just because we hadn't had a lot of vacation time. And it was the night before I had to go to the church and would start speaking all weekend. And so there were these hammocks right outside in the front of the hotel where you could look up. There were trees above us, and sort of like you said, the sky.
Yeah.
So let's just sit in these hammocks for a little bit, because when you're starting to go toward a weekend of ministry, I'm just kind of thinking, let's connect with God. Let's pray for the weekend. Let's go in there. Lisa's like, okay. So we get into 2 separate hammocks, and I looked at my watch. 8 minutes later, she goes, we got to get up and go do something. I go, honey, it's been 8 minutes. She goes, well, it feels like it's been 20 years in prison, because it's hard for her to be quiet, particularly on vacation. So I say that, Rob, you can try, but I've found if your spouse isn't built that way, they may never change, and that's okay. I adore Lisa. I cherish Lisa. I just recognize that these are different things, that we don't have to be the same. I'm just thrilled that she earnestly seeks God, that she hears from God, that the life of God is so full in her, even though she often connects with God in a different way.
I love that very real example. And that's helpful context too. This idea of like, it is okay to be different as long as you respect it and give each other space to flourish. That's wonderful. Now, for the couples listening that might be in a spot where they're saying like, hey, I love the idea of spiritual pathways. I love this idea of having different ways to relate to God, but maybe they just feel disconnected in their relationship when it comes to this area of spirituality and relating to God. What advice or encouragement would you have for those people?
Well, I think my marriage has been fed by our devotion to God. In all of my marriage books, it's closer to Christ, closer to others. It's God speaking into my heart. It's God convicting me if I'm not being the best husband. It's God giving me the love. Again, 1 John 4:19, we love because he first loved us. So I think the first thing is you got to figure out how you best connect with God. If you're not regularly feeding off of your love for God, growing in your sense of his presence, you're going to run out of your ability to love your spouse. So my first concern is, how are you connecting with God? A second concern then is, well, how can you learn from each other? And that's what the Pathways can do. We've got the book they can read through together. We've got actually a video series that's great for small groups, or a couple could do it together, where I talk about what the pathways are, and you could learn from each other. And the 2 things I always hear when groups go through this is, one, freedom for me to be the way I am. Sometimes, Rob, people feel intimidated when their spouse seems to really hear from God, or is a great intellectual. They get great stuff from Bible study, and the other one doesn't feel like they get that much. Or another one is an enthusiastic worshiper with contemporary worship songs. Or the other one is more just this contemplative, hearing things from God, or the ascetic who's so disciplined. And sometimes they feel intimidated because they feel like, man, my spouse feels like they really connect with God like that. And it's just running up against a wall for me.
Yeah.
And so understanding what the pathways are can set you free. Instead of being intimidated by your spouse, you can learn from your spouse and then find the way that maybe you can challenge your spouse. Your spouse hasn't realized, oh, there are other ways for me to really draw near to God and to hear from him and have my heart cleansed.
Yeah. And I could see it being intimidating if you have a spouse that's really heavy in the intellectual space, for example, and they know every genealogy and can recite everything word for word and all this stuff. And as a spouse that might be more of like an enthusiastic or something, you're looking at that and thinking like, that seems like so much work. And so having the freedom to just say, no, it's okay, we're different, I think is helpful for sure. Now, Gary, you talked a little bit about the idea of the book and some online courses. Where can people that are interested in learning more about sacred pathways and maybe the book find more information?
Yeah, well, the book is available anywhere books are sold. You can get on Christian Books or Amazon or whatnot. My website, if they want to read about it, it might have some introductory videos or whatnot. It's just my name, GaryThomas.com. So they can go to GaryThomas.com and they could see about it. And if you look under books and whatnot, they'll see a tag for Sacred Pathways and see what's there.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Gary, thank you so much for joining us today. We're thrilled to have our conversation. And for those listening, thanks for tuning into this episode of the Wind-Shaped Marriage Podcast. We'll catch you right back here next week.
We hope that conversation blesses your marriage. If you're loving the Wind-Shaped Marriage Podcast, will you please take a moment to make sure you're subscribed? You may be a faithful listener and not realized you aren't subscribed. It really helps us out. Also, if you've enjoyed these conversations and they've impacted your marriage, please rate and review this podcast. One listener said, "Thanks so much for pouring into couples with godly wisdom and practical equipping."